Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 horrifying cases of mistaken identity. Number 10. Teen mistakenly shoots younger brother. There is not much good about shootings in the cases of mistaken identity, so we're just going to jump in with an incredibly tragic instance to let you know that few good things come of these situations. In early 2013, a 16-year-old Florida teenager believed that a burglar had entered his house and, knowing his parents owned a firearm, located it and shot the person he thought was an intruder. It turned out to be his 12-year-old brother. The parents were out when the incident occurred, and when the older teen heard strange noises coming from another part of the house, he called out for his brother. There was no response, leading him to believe something was amiss. The younger brother approached the older one, startling him and prompting the shot. The older brother immediately called 911, but his brother was dead before the paramedics could get him to the hospital. Number 9. Unnamed man mistaken for bank robber held at gunpoint by cops. In 2013, a bank in Sarasota, Florida was robbed in the middle of the day. Not long after that, an unnamed man was out riding his bike when police descended on him, pointed guns at him, and threw him on the ground. As you might be able to guess, he was not the same man who had just robbed the bank. The real robber, who walked into the bank demanding money, escaped on foot. The police found the innocent man, who has remained anonymous by his own request, not too far from the bank, and seeing that he fit the description of the criminal, assumed he was the culprit. It did not help that while he was being handcuffed, he was identified as the bank robber by a witness. Things began to sort themselves out when police realized that he did not have any of the stolen money in his possession, nor did he have a gun or any other sort of weapon, and in fact, he was dressed differently than the real culprit. Fortunately, common sense prevailed and he was let off the hook, though we're guessing it wound up being the least pleasant lunch break he had ever had. Number 8. Assam rifles fire on each other. For those who are unaware, the Assam Rifles are a military force in India with a history that dates back to 1835, and they have served in several wars over the years. Today they work under the Ministry of Home Affairs and help provide internal security, such as fending off rebels and helping to provide border security. It was in this capacity that 2 AR personnel were killed a few years ago when, unfortunately, 2 groups from within AR mistook each other as rebels and opened fire on each other. One of the groups had received information about underground movement and set up an ambush, but sadly a separate AR group was on a foot patrol in the area when something set off the firefight. Unfortunately, it appears that poor coordination within the AR contributed to the 2 deaths. Number 7. Carlos DeLuna. Considering that life is not a Disney movie, cases of mistaken identity are oftentimes tragic. This was certainly the case for Carlos DeLuna, who was sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit, only for it to be later discovered that he was the tragic victim of a mistaken identity case. He had been innocent all along. Naturally, they only figured this out after he was dead. A study by a Columbia University law professor and his students concluded that the state of Texas executed an innocent man when DeLuna was put to death. DeLuna had been arrested and convicted of stabbing a gas station attendant to death, but maintained his innocence until the day his execution finally arrived. According to the law professor, James Liebman, the police failed to pursue other leads, and DeLuna received poor legal defense. It did not help that DeLuna had been arrested several times in the past, but as Liebman pointed out, he had no blood on him when he was taken into custody, and the police ignored potential evidence that the crime might have been committed by DeLuna's friend, Carlos Hernandez. And when we say might have, we mean probably did, considering that years later, just before he died in prison, Hernandez confessed. Number 6. Abby Guerra and Marlena Cantu. Imagine that you were told that you lost your daughter in a fatal car crash and planned the entire funeral, only to be told later that she was, in fact, still alive. And now imagine being in the opposite situation, believing your daughter had survived the crash, only to discover days later that she had actually perished. This is what happened to the families of Abby Guerra and Marlena Cantu, and it's sadly also a scenario that you'll see popping up on this list a little later. In 2010, Guerra and Cantu, who lived in Arizona, were involved in a deadly car accident on their way home from Disneyland. It was believed that Guerra died at the scene, while Cantu was taken away to the hospital for treatment. However, 6 days later, once swelling had gone down on the girl in the hospital, Cantu's family discovered it was Guerra and not their daughter who had in fact survived. Guerra's family had put on a car wash to raise funds for her funeral, but once the mistake was discovered, the funds instead went towards her medical expenses, as well as the funeral of Cantu. Number 5. Margie Carranza and Emma Hernandez. In early 2013, residents of Southern California were put in a state of crippling fear when former Navy reservist and LAPD officer Christopher Dorner went on a shooting rampage, killing 4 people, including 2 police officers, and injuring 3 more members of the LAPD. Dorner had posted a manifesto that included the names of several police officers, so it made sense that the LAPD would be a bit wary when a truck matching the description of Dorner's was seen near the house of one of those officers early one morning while he was still at large. Of course, what did not make as much sense was that the police opened fire on the truck, riddling it with bullet holes, despite not being clear on whether Dorner was inside or even if it was actually his truck. As you might have gathered by now, it was not. Instead, inside the truck were 47-year-old Margie Carranza and 71-year-old Emma Hernandez, who were out delivering copies of the LA Times when the police fired at least 102 shots into the truck. Neither were killed, thankfully, but Hernandez did take 2 bullets in the hail of gunfire. This was not the only incident of mistaken identity on that day either. Just 30 minutes later, another man was shot when police believed he was Dorner. That one is even more baffling though, as the victim was a thin white man while Dorner was a large black man. Number 4. Ronald Cotton. Rape is an awful thing. We're not exactly breaking down any barriers by telling you that. What's also awful is being falsely accused of committing such a heinous crime, which is exactly what happened to Ronald Cotton in 1984 when Jennifer Thompson, a then 22-year-old college student, claimed that Cotton was the man who raped her, leading to his conviction and serious prison time. One night, a man broke into Thompson's house and raped her, and she burned his face into her brain. Or at least she thought she had. Unfortunately for Cotton, he had been accused of sexual assault at the age of 16 when the mother of his then-girlfriend found him in bed with her daughter and called the police. The previous accusation did not help his case when Thompson looked at his photo at the police station and identified him as the man who raped her. As it turns out, mugshots of both Cotton and the actual attacker show a striking resemblance in terms of facial structure. After 11 years in prison, DNA evidence finally exonerated Cotton, and in a truly inspirational story of forgiveness, he and Thompson became good friends, even writing a book together. Number 3. Krystle Campbell. In the event of any public tragedy, there is bound to be confusion in the aftermath. After 9/11, authorities spent weeks attempting to confirm the number of casualties. That's why it's tragic, but not entirely surprising, that in the wake of the April 2013 Boston Marathon bombings, one family was subject to a case of mistaken identity, leading them to believe their daughter was all right. Sadly, that was not the case. Krystle Campbell was one of the 3 people killed in the bombings. However, when her father went to the hospital to try to learn whether she was okay, he was told his daughter was alive, but would possibly lose her legs. However, when he gained access to the hospital room, he discovered the victim was not his daughter. He was soon after informed that Krystle had died at the scene of the bombings. Number 2. Whitney Cerak and Laura Van Ryn. One of the most amazing cases of mistaken identity in recent memory is also one of the most heartbreaking, as it involves 2 families. Tragedy was replaced by a miracle for one, while hope became despair for the other. The 2 families were those of Whitney Cerak and Laura Van Ryn, 2 friends who were involved in a horrific car accident in 2006. The friends shared a strong resemblance, as both were young, attractive blondes, and apparently it was this resemblance that led to the confusion. So, what was the confusion, you ask? Oh, only that the coroner originally pronounced Whitney dead, while in fact she lay severely injured in the hospital for weeks under the assumption that she was, in fact, Laura. Even the families were convinced, as Laura's family sat at her bedside until her facial swelling had died down enough to finally confirm that she was not their daughter. Whitney was alive despite having recently had a closed casket funeral attended by more than 1,400 people. As it turns out, her parents never looked at the body to confirm it was their daughter, and there was no DNA test. It was simply taken as fact that the body had been identified correctly. Number 1. Adolf Beck. It could be argued that the case of Adolf Beck is the most famous and extraordinary mistaken identity case in history, as his case spawned books and remains not only one of the most notorious cases of mistaken identity, but also wrongful conviction on record. In fact, his case has even made it into textbooks studied in law school. Beck, who lived in Britain, found himself facing 15 convictions, all because a random woman who had met on the street one day in 1895 thought he looked like a man who had, a few weeks prior, robbed her of a fairly small amount of money. Unfortunately for Beck, the same swindler was wanted for several other similar thefts, leading to all those convictions. Astonishingly, the other victims of the actual thefts identified Beck as the culprit, with some even picking him out of a lineup. There had been similar crimes committed in 1877, but Beck at the time had been living in Peru. The judge ignored this evidence and sentenced him to 7 years in prison, of which he served 5. While he was imprisoned, yet more evidence mounted in his favor, such as how the actual thief named John Smith had been circumcised. After examination, it was discovered that Beck remained uncircumcised. The judge ignored this new evidence and left Beck to serve out his sentence, which puts him on record as being one of the worst judges in recorded history. After being released, he was accused yet again in 1904 and was convicted again as well. This time, however, fortune finally smiled on Beck when the real John Smith was arrested, pulling off yet another swindle while Beck sat in jail. Luckily, the judge didn't ignore the evidence this time around, and Beck was a free man. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, if you want to see some more videos that we put together that are similar to this one, check out those that are linked to over there on the right, as well as in the description below, and thank you for watching.